All right, good morning. How's everyone? Yeah, I got a thumbs up and a good. That's not bad, right? We're so close to the end of the semester, right? I wrote up there what we have left. It's kind of shocking how little we have left of the semester at this point. Oh, before I forget to, we have a special guest today. My mom's visiting from Wisconsin, right? Facing this way, right? So she gets to sit in. I was like, you get to be here for forensic psychology. She was excited to get to serial killers. But anyway, so today what we'll do, we'll wrap up the last slide or two of chapter 15, and then we'll move on to chapter 16, it's our last chapter. And we're gonna do like a 2-part participation exercise. We'll do part 1 of it today. And then Wednesday, I'm feeling like a sickness coming on that only universal students can hear. I will be there on Wednesday. In all fairness, that's my twins' birthday on Wednesday. They're turning 10. And all they wanted was to go to Universal. And I was like, okay, I can support that. So I'm sure you're really gonna be mad at me for that, but I'll eat like multiple churros there and some pretzels. We've already scouted out all the food, right? And I sadly won't be here. So it's their birthday and that's what they wanted. So hold them up here. And then on Monday, we will finish chapter 16 with the second part of that last activity. And then we have our 3rd exam, which is the final on that Wednesday, the 8th, right? And that's our last class session. So during finals week, we're not going to have anything. I will be here if you would like to come meet with me or check your grade, though I think it's a really good idea to be checking your grade now, right? If anything looks wrong or is missing, now is a great time to let me know. Can very easily fix it. Once I submit final grades in a few weeks, it's kind of challenging to change it signatures. So if you notice something's wrong, just let me know. We're going to move on with that, but yeah, be double checking that between now and then. And I did grade all of your final papers, right? So I went through everyone who turned them in, I graded them. Overall, they were really great, right? There was just a few things that I saw like consistently, like a few people didn't do a title page or a references page, which was the first thing I checked for. A couple of people forgot to put their show on the references page. And the other big thing was just like not going to do all of the criteria. So maybe a little short in that diagnostic section, but a lot of A's, a lot of really wonderful papers. I enjoyed reading them. As far as papers go, I think it could be way worse. So hopefully, if you have any questions about your grade, you can always ask me or email me. But I try to give you feedback with that rubric as well as to where you lost points if you did lose any points. So any questions about any of that before we go back here? Okay. So we talked about all the different like dementias and neurocognitive disorders, and we talked a little bit about this, but just to kind of wrap that up and a few more things before we move on. I showed you that video, and there's so much research being done on this, on how to kind of intervene early. And unfortunately, if you're kind of doomed to get one of these cognitive diseases, you can't necessarily prevent that 100%, but you can delay it for a very long time based on the choices that you make. And that's kind of what a lot of the efforts are focused on, is delaying, right? So making like good choices on the next slide we'll talk about. But as far as treatments go, as I wrote up here before, sadly, these aren't things that we can reverse, but we can kind of slow them down, especially in the very early stages. So we often give things called cholinesterase inhibitors, which reduce the buildup of like acetylcholine. We target dopamine a little bit, right? There's a lot of like neurotransmitters that are playing a role that we can kind of slow down in the early stages. But in the later stages, these treatments don't tend to be very effective. At that point, they're not helping anymore. So what we're trying to do a lot of work with is kind of preventative efforts, things like stem cell research. So back in 2009, the ban on stem cell research was lifted, and there's a lot of like ideas here about how could we potentially use like the immune system, like that last video we watched showed. How could we use stem cells to maybe like continue that replication over and over again? So looking at different ways to try and prevent on a bigger level, but as of right now, all we can do is kind of slow the progression of some of these different things. Yeah.
Why was stem cell research banned?
So a lot of like moral and ethical reasons, right? A lot of people struggle with the idea of doing like genetic and stem cell research, thinking it can kind of snowball into bigger things, which it can, but there's a lot of like religious, ethical, moral like questioning. And so Obama lifted the ban on it back in 2009. And so that has allowed for a lot of different research to take place, but that's why it was banned. And a lot of, again, fear of where it could lead, right? And kind of all the like sci-fi movies, right? Of like it leads to cloning and all these other like, things down the line. So there's a lot of regulations on it, but it's definitely something here where how could we use this to maybe cause some of those brain cells to regenerate in a different way, right? Again, kind of in the early stages, but still trying to figure it out. Yeah. Neurocognitive is the like technical term for them because they affect the brain mostly, right? And your neurology, your neurons that are like firing and communicating. Neurodegenerative, similar, but neurocognitive would be like the technical. They used to be called dementias, but they changed it in the DSM-5. So some of the other things that you can do, and these are things we should probably all be doing anyway, but easier said than done, right? So there's kind of 6 pillars of things that you can do that will delay the onset of things like the neurocognitive disorders or Alzheimer's specifically: exercise, diet, mental stimulation, sleep, stress management, and maintaining an active social life, right? And again, these aren't like cure-alls, but they can definitely push things way, way back for you if you're having like all of these things in place. There's more and more research suggesting that diet plays a really critical role, right? And we're seeing eating a lot of like sugars and trans fats and certain foods actually put you more at risk than maybe we thought that they did. So having good exercise, when you exercise, you increase like blood flow. You're also, which goes to the brain as well. Your brain needs to be exercised just as much as your body. Your diet, so suggesting things like following a Mediterranean diet. So lots of like smaller meals, lots of omega-3 fats, right? Eating across the rainbow, right? Lots of dietary suggestions. And this is something, as I mentioned, that's getting more and more popular to focus on because we're seeing a lot of correlates with diet. Staying mentally active, right? So doing like brain games. There's so many wonderful games like that you can download on your phone to play. I do my child's rapid math, do Paisley's rapid math every night with her. I'm not very good at it, right? We race. I win just by a hair, right? She's in 4th grade. I should win by more than that, but that's okay. But doing little things like strategy games and puzzles and riddles, reading, being in school, right? Sometimes we talk about following the road less traveled. I don't know about all of you, but I'm such a creature of habit. Like I go the same way to school every day, go the same way to my office every day, the same path every single day. And if you can take a different route, something as small as like get to your next class in a different way, it forms new pathways in your brain, right? Little things like that that push you and keep you mentally active are always important. Getting good sleep, right? Sleeping at night by letting your brain recover and restore. Managing your stress. Stress can be really damaging. We talked about stress months ago, right? At this point, or like a month and a half ago, that too much stress builds up and causes problems in your system as well. And then having like friends and being active and being social, people that you interact with. All of these things are considered like protective factors. Yeah.
Maybe had severe insomnia for the majority of their life. Do you see an increase in this type of stuff?
So it's definitely going to be one thing that could play a role. I mean, the hard part is these diseases are just disorders of aging, right? And so the second that you hit like your late 60s, they just happen as a product of how our body and brain ages. But it then like that multiplies with every like 10 years that you get older and older. Like by the time you're in your 90s, you're very likely to get these things just as a product of aging. So if sleep is a tough one for you, then it's important to really pick up the other ones, right? And kind of like help compensate. I mean, it's tough. Some people need less sleep than others, right? Like I sleep maybe 6-7 hours a night, and that works for me. Other people need to sleep like 10 to feel okay. So I think it's more like what your body is used to. And then if you kind of deprive it of what it needs for years and years and years, that could kind of chip away at your resiliency a little bit, but it's not necessarily destined to, if that makes sense. Sure. Any other questions here? Oh, people always have the 5 W's. It's like the who, what, when, where, and why, right? Like kind of processing things in different ways, right? Like really trying to think about information, form new pathways, and keep your brain active, which you're all doing by being here as well. Anything else at all with chapter 15? Anything else with the neurocognitive disorders, dementias, prevention, anything else here? Then are you ready for this? Our last set of slides. Oops. It's getting in the way of my dramatic moment here, right? Ready? These are our last slides, our last chapter of the semester, but it's a good chapter, right? I think this is a fun chapter. Anyone in here interested in forensic psychology or like considering maybe forensic psychology? A few of you maybe. This is a topic that tends to really interest people. And I think it's a fun one. We used to have a specific forensic psychology class and it kind of got scaled back because of COVID and things before that, but hopefully we'll re-add it again at some point because it's very popular. Here we're looking at how the legal system and psychology interact with each other. And so there's kind of 2 sides to this. Then we'll look at one side today and the other side when we get there next week. But we'll look at how do clinicians influence the criminal system, and then how does the criminal judicial system influence clinicians, right? So kind of both sides of the coin. And this whole chapter is about those intersections between psychology and the law, right? And so if you practice in the field of psychology, there are laws that you are bound by. You're governed by these laws. They're there to protect your clients and protect the people that you're helping. If you commit a crime and go through the legal system, psychology. And we'll focus on the first one today, how psychology can affect like trials and legal proceedings. And I'm obviously not a lawyer. I'm not trained in like legal stuff. And this is a very like case by case thing. You'll see, and we'll do a little activity with these. A lot of trials related to this topic get complicated. And they have multiple verdicts over multiple years. But we'll look at some of the kind of common verdicts and things that can happen along the way. So the first side, again, the side that we'll look at today, is focused on something called criminal commitment. How does this idea of like psychological disorders and psychological factors affect the law? And so the thought here is that if somebody commits a crime, how do we ensure that they're tried fairly? And what happens if we have 2 people that commit the same crime, but one has a severe mental illness and one doesn't? Should we treat those 2 people differently? And this is a very controversial like topic, and again, very case by case. But the thought is that if somebody has a mental illness that might have influenced the way that they were thinking, the way that they made decisions, we can't treat them the same as somebody who was of sound mind and didn't have a mental illness. And so we're in this realm that we call criminal commitment. If you are accused of a crime, we have to decide, are you mentally stable enough to defend yourself? Are you mentally stable enough to be held accountable for the crimes that you committed? And again, this can be complicated, and you'll see that a little bit as we get to some examples. So there's a couple of different verdicts that can come out of this idea. And the one that's the most famous, and that you probably heard of, is not guilty by reason of insanity. And so if somebody commits a crime and they had a mental illness such as like schizophrenia or maybe severe abuse for years of their life, something like that, they could plead insanity. Insanity is a really complicated concept. And it's not a mental illness, right? We tend to think of insanity, oh, someone's insane, they have a mental illness. It's actually a legal term, not a disorder. And the kind of short definition of insanity is at the time of committing a crime. So when you commit the crime, because of a mental illness, you did not know right from wrong or could not resist an uncontrollable impulse to act. So how do we prove that? Not easy to do, but we'll talk about that a little bit. But if somebody pleads insanity, they're saying that when they committed the crime, they didn't know right from wrong, they couldn't control themselves, and it was all because they had a mental illness. Most common mental illness that people would have will be something like schizophrenia, because they're out of contact with reality. Or maybe again, like abuse, we see that come up quite a bit, or really severe like bipolar disorder or something that causes you to have hallucinations or delusions. But when you're pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, you're saying that I shouldn't be held accountable for this crime because I was insane at the time. Very, very rarely granted. People who plead this only get it granted like less than 1% of the time. But they tend to be really famous cases, so we hear about them in the news, making it seem really common. But it's not granted very often because it's difficult to prove that you were insane. It requires a lot of like evaluations by psychiatrists and psychologists, multiple like assessments and batteries. People have tried to fake it. People have tried to fake multiple personalities. Like it was my other personality that made me do it, but it often doesn't hold up. They don't like consistently show the right signs and symptoms. It's also really criticized as being unfair, right? Why should this person not have to go to jail for the rest of their life when somebody else who committed the same crime does? But typically, if someone's found not guilty by reason of insanity, it's not like they just go home and they're free. Oftentimes they're mandated to treatment. They might even go to like a psychiatric hospital for a time. There's not just like you're completely like get off without any kind of punishment, but you're not held to the same standard as somebody who didn't have a mental illness. And I love this, right? Mr. Evans, it's a speeding ticket. You can't plea insanity. You can't plea it for everything. But you often see this with like, bigger charges like murder and so on. Any thoughts so far? Questions or anything so far? Yeah. Yeah, so diagnosing someone with schizophrenia is relatively easy to do, right? Like if you went to a psychologist and you're talking about, odd thinking and perception and hallucinations and delusions, a diagnosis is easy to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But to prove that your schizophrenia caused your insanity could take months and months to do. So typically what they would do is bring in like a panel of witnesses or like a subject matter like experts, and they would interview that person in different ways, trying to see if that actually affected their mental status or not. And that could take months to do. And that's why some of these trials last so long, because it takes a long time to prove insanity. But getting a diagnosis of this could be like one session, like very quick. But the insanity plea is complicated, if that makes sense. Other thoughts? You were nodding pretty vigorously with that. Did you have a
Working residential place, and this girl had schizophrenia and like really, really severe. And she's just interesting. But she was there because she got charged with armed assault.
Mhm.
And they were like, oh no, she has to go to jail. She has to go to jail. Like she did, like the lawyers would come in and talk to some of the caseworkers, and I was there too. So I got, because I was her one-to-one, so I got to like be there. I was interested.
Yeah.
But it took, I want to say, 8 months for this girl who's clearly schizophrenic to be like, okay, yeah, this reason of insanity. Like,
Sure.
8 months. I'm like, this girl literally thinks there are aliens in her body. Like, no, like that's pretty clear. And everybody was like, all the higher ups were saying like, no, she's schizophrenic. Like we have this, and like, they have all this evidence, and the lawyers still 8 months, right? For them to just go, okay, no, the charges, like she just has to stay there for like 8 months. That was just the whole thing. That's
so interesting, right? And it's frustrating because, like you're saying, very obviously has schizophrenia, very obviously has delusions and things that are out of place. But there's this fear, we don't want to, tell some or give someone this verdict if they don't actually warrant it. And I think that's one of the biggest criticisms, which is why it takes so long, to make sure they're not faking, to make sure that it's a consistent state of mind. There's a lot of checks and balances along the way. Yeah.
Really schizophrenic, like it's
Yeah.
Or she got transported to jail 3 times, and then she got put back because she would be extremely schizophrenic in a jail, tormenting other people.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Crazy.
I love that you shared that, because that's often the case. Like I said, months, right? It can be a very long process. And sometimes people are in a psychiatric facility during that time. Sometimes they're in jail receiving treatment during that time. It really depends on a whole host of factors, but these trials and proceedings and verdicts are complicated, right? And they're very time consuming, right? And often get reversed. It's wild when you look at the legal proceedings for these are the kind of cases where you see like they get one verdict and then it's like appealed and they get another verdict and another, and it's just ongoing. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm.
But yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah. And again, less than 1% of people who plead this are actually granted it. That's how challenging it is to get this verdict. But it's often people who really have it that end up receiving it. So I guess that's at least the way you would hope it would be. Some other verdicts that are more common. So not guilty by reason of insanity is the one that we always hear about, right? But it's really, really rare. These ones are much more common. Guilty but mentally ill. Yeah, you committed a crime, right? And you have a mental illness, but it's not enough for us to excuse you from the crime. It's not enough for us to say like, oh, we shouldn't hold you responsible for it. So like with this, let's say somebody had bipolar disorder, right? Or depression, or, they have something going on, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, something bigger, and they commit a crime, and they have a mental illness, but it's not enough to warrant that like not guilty or insanity plea. So you're guilty but mentally ill, you would go to jail and oftentimes receive mental illness treatment in jail. So you found guilty, you go to jail, but you still receive some kind of treatment while you're there. And anyone who goes to jail who has a mental illness would still receive treatment, but it's often mandated if that's your verdict. Guilty with diminished capacity can also happen. So let's say that we find you guilty of the crime. We think that your mental illness played a role, but it's not enough to excuse you, right? And so what often happens with this one is maybe we find you guilty of a lesser crime. So instead of being found guilty of like first-degree murder, maybe it's like manslaughter, right? So you get a lesser verdict, a lesser sentence, because we take your mental illness into account. So you're still guilty, you still go to jail, but for less time and a lesser sentence than you would have if you were found like guilty without that diminished capacity. Those two are really common. A lot of people have mental illnesses, found guilty, go to jail, or maybe a slightly lesser sentence. All of these first three, right, those two plus the one on the previous slide, have to do with the time of the crime, when the crime was committed. But there's one other way that this could all kind of be affected. Sometimes when people commit a crime, the crime itself can change them or cause a psychotic break or cause like mental illness or damage from the crime. And people can be found what's called mentally incompetent to stand trial. You're not able to understand the charges against you. You're not able to prepare an adequate defense. And so we find you mentally incompetent. You're not capable of standing trial because of your mental status. If this is the case, you would go to a psychiatric facility until you are competent to stand trial, and then you go through the verdicts like normal. Sometimes people who have this go to a psychiatric facility and they never get out, right? They're never competent enough to stand trial. But this is another verdict that we can sometimes see. And typically once people get their medication under control, kind of get under control and balanced, then they might go back and go through the other proceedings. So these are the common ways that you see mental illness like play out. A lot of famous cases involving this. And we're going to do an activity with these folks that'll kind of take us some of our time today and then into our next class. But I want to give you some examples of cases. And these are people that you will probably recognize. This is a frightening slide of people, right? Really fascinating, but frightening, right? So we start up in the top right corner here. Andrea Yates, famous for drowning her 5 children in the bathtub. I'm just going to give you a tiny bit for each one, and then you're going to be picking one of these folks, right? But she had very severe postpartum psychosis, drowned her 5 children in the bathtub because she thought they weren't developing properly. Jeffrey Dahmer, probably one of the most famous, serial killers up here, killed 15 to 17 young men, cut them up into pieces. Very, very well-known, terrifying serial killer. Next to Ed Gein, who's again another like frightening person. They're all frightening, but interesting. Ed Gein was the Wisconsin murderer and grave robber. A lot of scary people from Wisconsin. I don't know why, right? But he would remove the skin and sew body parts together, making furniture and trophies of his victims. Your face, you're like, that's awful, right? John Wayne Gacy, the clown killer. Last semester, so cool. I had a student whose mom had Gacy to her birthday party as a kid, as a clown, had a picture of it and everything. Never in a million years. Can you imagine how frightening? But Gacy would dress up as a clown and go to birthday parties as Pogo the Clown. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but was rejected outright, committed quite a bit of cases of sodomy and murdered like 30 young men, burying them in the crawl space underneath his house. Up at the top, John Hinckley Jr. tried to assassinate President Reagan to impress actress Jodie Foster, right? Wrote her a whole letter and everything, really like wild and underneath him, David Berkowitz, sexually assaulted and kidnapped quite a few women. Francine Hughes at the bottom set her husband on fire while he was sleeping after years of abuse. One of the newer cases down here, Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser, really interesting, two 12-year-old girls who stabbed another 19 times to impress a fictional character named Slenderman. Probably one of the newer cases up here. Mark David Chapman assassinated John Lennon and then remained at the scene reading Catcher in the Rye to be arrested by the cops. Lorena Bobbitt, very famous for cutting her husband's penis off after years of abuse, threw it out the car window. Lots of interesting facts about that one. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, sent quite a few packages through the mail, writing the Unabomber manifesto. James Holmes, the Colorado Joker killer, dressed up as the Joker, went into a movie theater in Colorado, shooting and killing quite a few people during a show of Batman. I went to this theater 3 days before this happened. I lived in Colorado at the time, and I went to the theater 3 days before. Well, not to see that movie, but a different movie. Oh, and then finally, Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn, probably one of the, again, like a newer, more like contemporary case, right, where we have stabbing the mother to death as a result of like years and years of being made to think that she was really sick. A lot of like Munchausen by proxy stuff going on here. So these are all cases that involved insanity pleas in some way, right? Whether they were granted it or pleaded it or found mentally incompetent, every single person up here has some involvement of the verdicts that we just talked about. So what we're gonna do for the rest of our time today is I'm gonna have you get into groups, right? And you're gonna spend some time researching one of these people or one of these pairs of people. There's a couple of pairs. So what I'd like you to do is form a group of like 3 or 4 people, right? Whatever is convenient around you. But you are going to be presenting on, so you don't want to have less than 3, or it puts a lot of pressure on you. So let's say 3 or 4, and then be looking at these, come up with who you're interested in. We're not going to have any repeats, so maybe have like a backup in mind. As soon as you know who you want, let me know, and I'll come over to your group and they are yours. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to do some research on them, right? So work on it now. I don't want this to be homework for you as we near the end of the semester. You don't need any more homework. So you're gonna look up your person, find out some background about them. Who are they? Where'd they grow up? Tell us a little bit about them. What crimes did they commit? And then describe their legal proceedings, right? Where are they now? Would be an interesting one as well. Some of these people are still alive, some of them are not. And then on Monday, you're going to be presenting on it. So today's just kind of building that knowledge and getting that information. You can write it on the back of this or take notes, but spend the time researching them. So form groups, and then I'll come around and give you your person as soon as you know who you want. Grab a pen.
Which one do you want? I think Andrew.
They're all terrible. Why don't I choose any of them?
Some are more interesting, yep. All right.
Okay,
You wanna go?
Crazy.
Yeah.
It's not American Ocean, right?
You don't want to comply. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe we do like.
You all sound.
I'll think we junior, I guess. The one that's not as bad. We tried to go for the.
You want to smoke? Okay, so you wanna go?
All right.
John?
All right. So go, and really interesting, we should look up this letter.
It's that.
Background, like what time does he describe
Background.
So I don't know the last meetings of the. It's where and.
You see, he's not really bad.
Yeah, I think we.
You didn't actually kill anybody.
Yeah.
Three of us.
The salt in a bunch of it, which is cool. I'll never mind. He killed one guy, but you know what?
Same thing. No, no, not a lot. That would feel like that's.
But it's just mixed up.
Oh, here.
You must have one guy over 5,000.
Yeah, really wild.
I think he was obsessed with.
Yeah.
Travis Bickles.
Yeah, just kind of like when you know.
Oh.
Like, yeah. But homes and. It's a body.
Oh, do you want to look up you want to use the background and then, right?
Yeah.
A brief background.
His background is sort of like early life in Pratt. Also,
Yeah.
why don't they were presenting this on?
Does everybody have your vision?
Thought she meant Wednesday. Are we presenting this on Wednesday?
No, because Wednesday we won't have class, so it'll be Monday.
Oh. So what's this?
Oh, you're missing it, okay.
Oh, wait.
Well, I'll just put John Hinckley Jr.
Yeah, I know that.
Okay, he was Warren.
All right. Just a couple last thoughts. So the people we have taken, we have Yates, Donner, Hinckley, Kaczynski, Gacy, Gain, Holm, and then the two pairs, right? So lots of interesting folks, right? Kind of the older cases didn't get taken, but the newer ones all did. So what I want you to focus on for the rest of your time today, do your research, get your thoughts and notes all written out, so you don't have to do any of this later. Talk about as a group how you're gonna handle presenting this. You are going to come up here and present it to the class. And I'd like you to make like one slide or one page or something that you can use as like a benchmark to help yourself. So what you can do is email that to me sometime before that Monday, or you can open it up here at the beginning. If you email it to me, I'll make sure it's open and up here for you. It doesn't have to be anything complicated, and again, you can do that now. I'm hoping if you're efficient, you should be able to do all this now in this last like 40 minutes without any problem. But work on this, I'll be floating around. If you're done and finished and feel good as a group, and you finish early, that's fine, you can go. But I'm giving you the rest of the time. And then remember, just while I still have you all, we won't have class on Wednesday because I'm gonna be so sick then, make me feel so, right? All right, so good luck. I'll be wandering around if you have any questions.
Or let's-